Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to see your bright and shining faces all over America this morning on a not so bright and shining day here in Florida. It's not quite pitch black outside here at 9 or so in the morning Central Time, but it's dark. And so hopefully our power will remain on in the midst of this thunderstorm, and we'll get a chance to hear the good news of our Lord Jesus Christ, the good shepherd. You know, if we had church in a building and in the traditional ways, certainly since World War II, the way you begin a Good Shepherd Sunday is by getting a bulletin from an usher, and it's almost always the same picture, some kind of animated picture of Jesus with a sheep or a lamb over his shoulders. So it's Good Shepherd Sunday, and for that reason, we listen to not only the reason of the Good Shepherd Sunday, but because it was Queen Elizabeth's one of her favorite hymns, "The Lord is My Shepherd," this morning, sung by the opera singer from London. And so it begs the question, well, what is a shepherd, and why does Jesus use this parable this morning for us to understand the kingdom of heaven? Well, you have to put it in context, you have to go back to ancient times when the job of being a shepherd was a really challenging one. You know, Jesus paints this picture today in talking about this parable. He paints this picture for us of a shepherd having 100 sheep and losing one. Well, when he's talking about the wilderness, many of you have seen pictures or watched documentaries or seen movies about the wilderness around Galilee. We're talking about a desert climate. This is not the kind of wilderness that we have in the southeastern United States with thickets and pine trees. We're talking wilderness of scrub brush and in many cases desert, and certainly mountainous terrain. We see that in our Old Testament lesson today with God and Moses talking on the mountain. And so when Jesus says, you leave the 99 in the wilderness to go look for the one, he's talking about a very dangerous endeavor. He's talking about leaving 99 sheep, which is a pretty good sized herd for just one shepherd. Imagine that, just that scene of trying to keep track of 100 sheep in a mountainous, arid, desert-like climate, and one doesn't turn up, one gets lost. How do you even begin to know whether that one is lost in the first place? But then to take the time and risk of leaving the 99 behind to go find the one is a dangerous endeavor. But it's up to the good shepherd to go find that person, or that sheep in this case. And when that sheep is found, rejoice. And so what Jesus is talking about here was something that was very real to the people that were listening to him. There were probably in the crowd that he's telling this parable to, among the Pharisees, who of course are always criticizing him. He's probably talking to people who, if they're not shepherds, have some shepherds in their family. And so everyone gets this kind of very real description of what it's like to have 100 sheep and yet lose one. The parable, of course, is not about sheep or taking care of animals or husbandry. It's about sin, and it's about the kingdom of heaven. You see, in order to be a good shepherd, God has to keep track of all of us. And one of us who gets too far away from him is ultimately one that God wants to find through his son, Jesus Christ, and ultimately rejoices when one is returned. Jesus tells us at the end of both this and the parable of the lost coin, he tells us that there's rejoicing in heaven, not only by God, but by the angels, when one sinner repents and comes back to God. Because after all, that's what sin means. You know, in the modern sense, we think of sin as doing something wrong. But in the ancient sense, in the theological sense that Jesus uses this parable today, sin doesn't have anything to do with wrongdoing, although certainly most of the time when someone sins, that involves wrongdoing, like we hear about in our psalm this morning, when the psalmist is saying, I was wicked from the womb. We all sin. It's part of human nature, but it's not so much a particular action that's wrong. It's being separate from God or being distant from God. And so the parable of the lost sheep is such an important one because it tells us that God's willing to forgive, just like Paul tells the people in his letter to Timothy. God's willing to forgive our sin because he just wants us to be part of the flock. He wants us to be close to him. If sin then is distance from God, God rejoices when we are back to him. Now, when we talk about the parable of the Good Shepherd and think about Jesus on the bulletin holding the sheep over his shoulders, I think it's also important to note that that is not only a good parable, a good metaphor for how we interact with God, but it's a role model for our lives here on earth. As we reflect on the life and service of Queen Elizabeth II, who passed away this Thursday, I think it's no small measure that we celebrate Good Shepherd Sunday immediately following her death and hopefully glorious entry into the kingdom of heaven. After 70 years of leading England and the Commonwealth and the realms and all the different parts of Great Britain and the United Kingdom, after 70 years of dutiful service, I think it's easy to see how Queen Elizabeth was in fact a good shepherd. Not only was "The Lord is my shepherd" one of her favorite hymns, she as a queen was a role model of dutiful, loyal service to the people that she tended. Her flock got smaller over the years because of the way in post-World War II, the United Kingdom shrank and gave freedom to so many territories that had colonized over the 200 years before that. But even as the number of subjects in her flock shrank, she never gave up on her duty, her loyalty, and her care for the people that were in her kingdom and part of her flock. And so when you think about, well, what does it take to be a good shepherd? It means that you're not just in a position where you're required to care for those. It's that you love caring for them. That duty, that loyalty, that caring is something that she reflected every day of those 70 years, starting with what now I think is really an iconic recording of a speech that she gave right before her coronation, where basically she said, "For my whole life, whether it's long or short, I will give it to the people of England, the people of the United Kingdom, in service to them." And she did. And so as a role model to all of us. I would say furthermore that as we look at the Queen's life and work and think about how it impacts us, there's a very kind of tangible effect of her role, not only as the Queen of England, but the leader of the United Kingdom. Her title I read in some report this week after her passing, and there have been many, as I'm sure y'all have noticed. Her title was not only monarch of the United Kingdom, leader of the Commonwealth, leader of the realms, but also defender of the faith. You see, the Queen of England was very much a part of our worship here together at Online Home Church. We are part of the Episcopal Church of the United States, and the Episcopal Church of the United States is part of the Anglican Communion. So the Church of England is one part of the Anglican Communion. The Episcopal Church of the United States is another, but there are over 80 countries in the Anglican community and something like 40 million people, depending on how you count it, all around the globe. The vast majority of them are in those commonwealths and realms. And so the Queen is not only revered as a political leader in those former territories and colonies where they have just gotten their freedom during her reign or immediately before her reign, but also look to her as a religious figure. You know, this Book of Common Prayer that we use every day in our worship, whether you have an actual book like I'm holding in my hands, or whether you use the one that we provide on our website electronically, this Book of Common Prayer still bears the fingerprints of not this Queen Elizabeth, but Queen Elizabeth I. You see, back in the 1530s, she sat down with an English, but Roman Catholic, I guess, in hindsight, a priest named Richard Cranmer. And she and Cranmer wrote the original Book of Common Prayer that was published for the first time in 1537. This book of prayer that we have in the Episcopal Church of the US is different. It includes many different hymns like we were talking about today. "The Lord is my shepherd" is an English hymn, not an American one. But fundamentally, the way it's organized, the way it's written, and the way that it is held up now for nearly 500 years bears the marks and the fingerprints of Queen Elizabeth I. And so when Queen Elizabeth II, during her 70-year reign, was commissioned as the defender of the faith, she took very real responsibility for leading the Church of England and the leader of the Anglican Communion as part of her role. Time and time again, she would visit with the Archbishop of Canterbury, who is the leader by tradition of the Anglican Communion, for various theological and spiritual issues, including, goodness, as a mother and as a shepherd of her own immediate family, a lot of challenges. I heard in a recap of her life and the family that she created and led. 3 of her children had divorces. And in English law, being divorced, or English canon law, being divorced kind of puts you on the outside looking in. So as the leader of the faith, to be challenged just with that dynamic alone was a serious one. But you'll see in the coming days, I think her funeral is scheduled for 10 days from now, maybe 9. It's the 19th. It's coming up in the next week or so. You'll see a lot of what we as Americans see as pomp and pageantry in the course of her funeral. But just take note that one of the reasons it's all going to be focused very much on Westminster Abbey and the church is that not only was she the Queen of England, but she's also the leader of the Church of England and the Anglican Communion. And so the Archbishop of Canterbury, who is our leader by tradition, but has no real role in the way we as American Episcopalians worship and celebrate, he will be a very central part of all of that, because she was, it's funny, as Americans, we really believe in the separation of church and state. There is no such thing in England. She was the leader of the state and the leader of the church. And so we'll see that kind of unfold here in the coming weeks. Looking back on her 70 years, it's also, as I reflected on it this morning, it's also important to note that nearly 25% of her reign was in wartime conditions. And I don't mean post-World War II Europe, I mean post-September 11th Western civilization. You see, England was our partner in the United States. England was our partner, and the United Kingdom was our partner every step of the way after September 11th of 2001, when we, as a nation, suffered those blows in New York and in Virginia. The United Kingdom was there every step of the way, both in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so when you look back on the Queen's reign of those 70 years, she didn't have to deal with Vietnam like we did as Americans. The British were part of the Korean War, but not nearly so much as the Americans. And so the big kind of wartime threat to England that she oversaw was in Iraq and Afghanistan, with enduring freedom and Iraqi freedom. And nearly 20 years later, you look back on that kind of time frame, 25% of her reign was spent with some component of the RAF, the Royal Navy, or the British Army in Afghanistan or Iraq, including her grandsons. And so when we think about September 11th and reflect on that important day that we mark today here on our Sunday at Online Home Church, we also think about it as not just an American event, but a global event. I will tell you, having served during those times, that the British, the Canadians, the Australians were there every step of the way with the Americans as we tried to root out the terrorist threats that continue to face our nation even several years after September 11th. And so as you look upon this grand scope of 70 years of global history, there were certainly ups and downs for the Queen. There were certainly ups and downs for the United Kingdom, but on the whole, that give us a role model of what it means to be a good shepherd. And that includes duty, loyalty, and caring for those that she loved and that were her subjects, but also steadfastness and perseverance. And so as we think about what does the life of Queen Elizabeth mean for us here as Americans in 2022, I hope you'll take away those aspects of her character, those aspects of her service, and see how they apply in your life. As I look around in my own living room, as I look around at our faces here at Online Home Church gathered today, I don't see any monarchs, but I certainly see lots of people who can be good shepherds.
Amen.
Amen. And now, with Christians around the world, the United Kingdom, and across time, let's say